So I'm going to be talking about the tax and benefit changes that we had in the budget yesterday. So Rob's already told you about the stamp duty reform for first-time buyers. Now, apart from that, yesterday didn't see any really major changes in terms of taxes and benefits. But the Chancellor did announce some more modest reforms to alcohol and fuel duties, universal credit, and business taxes. You might have also noticed the Chancellor said that he wanted families to be able to keep more of the money that they earn, and so he was increasing the personal allowance and higher rate thresholds. What he didn't mention is that those increases are in fact just in line with the default inflation uprating, and so in real terms these are in fact unchanged. So I won't be talking about those for the rest of the presentation. So kicking off with fuel duties. So by default, fuel duties increase with RPI inflation. The Chancellor announced yesterday a freeze for this coming year, which costs the government about £800 million a year. The OBR described this as the inevitable freeze, as it's merely the latest episode in the ongoing story of fuel duty rise cancellations, which cumulatively now have cost £6 billion per year to the Exchequer since 2010. Let me show you what those freezes look like. So this line here shows the rate of fuel duty in today's prices for a litre of petrol, going back to 2008. As you can see, since 2010, fuel duty has consistently fallen in real terms. But the government's plans have always been to increase fuel duty. So when the coalition government came to power in 2010, it planned to increase fuel duty like this. Now, it cancelled the first rise, but it turned out that that became a bit of a habit. So each year, the government's official plans for fuel duty would be for it to rise, but each year it would cancel any upcoming rise. Before yesterday, the government's official policy was for fuel duty to rise in line with that green line you can see there. But the freeze means that the day of fuel duty rises has been pushed back again, costing, as I said, £800 million per year. If the government continues to freeze fuel duty, which based on past performance wouldn't be an entirely unreasonable expectation, its real value, of course, will continue to fall, as you can see there. If it froze fuel duty for the rest of the Parliament, that would cost about £3 billion a year. However, the bigger picture here is that in their future plans, the government continues to rely on fuel duty rises. That's the blue line I just showed you, is that they intend to increase it in future years. But if the government has no real intention of going through with those rises, then the true state of the public finances are worse than current forecasts imply. Now, perhaps the Chancellor wants to permanently keep fuel duty at 57.95p per litre. Maybe that's just a number he's particularly keen on. But if so, then he should probably just say so, rather than continually pretending that a fuel duty rise and the revenue that comes with it is just around the corner. The government also announced plans to freeze most alcohol duties. Again, this represents history repeating itself. The OBR call this the traditional freeze, as this is the 6th real terms cut to duties since 2010, which cumulatively now costs the government about £1 billion a year. The Chancellor also highlighted a plan to increase duty on high-strength cider, citing concerns about excessive consumption. Now, in increasing alcohol duty for a particular drink, we should keep in mind the context of the overall structure of alcohol duty schedules. So here I'm going to show you the tax rates and how they vary for different types of alcohol and different strengths of drink. So as you can see, as I bring them up, the overall structure is pretty haphazard, and cider actually is taxed particularly lightly. But the government's plans concern only ciders between 6.9 and 7.5%, which covers about 9% of the cider market, including White Lightning, you'll be interested to know. Now, they haven't told us yet what the rates they plan to set in this zone is, but clearly, in the context of the overall alcohol duty system, the change will be, and you knew it was coming, pretty small beer. it will leave the vast majority of the cider market with a pretty low tax rate per unit, at least compared to other drinks. So cider will remain the most tax-efficient form of drinking. Now, part of the reason why alcohol duties are structured in the way they are is because of EU regulations which restrict exactly what the government can do. And so leaving the EU does provide a Brexit opportunity, in the Chancellor's words, to rationalise the alcohol duty system more broadly. You don't necessarily have to tax all units of alcohol in any drink at the same rate, but it's unlikely that the ideal system would look like the kind of schedule you can see on the screen. Moving away from duties, the Chancellor yesterday announced several changes to universal credit. So just to give you a quick recap on UC. Universal credit is a big reform to the working age benefit system. It brings together 6 means-tested benefits into a single payment. Now, this considerably simplifies the system in that claimants just have to claim one benefit as opposed to many. And it also gets rid of some of the worst work incentives that were present under the previous system. The process of people being moved to UC has begun, and so far about 600,000 are on UC. On the government's plans, that will rise to 7 million by 2022-23, which will be pretty much everybody who claims a working age means-tested benefit. However, these plans for rollout have been continually delayed, and yesterday was no different. I'm going to show you these delays. So back in 2013, the government expected the universal credit rollout to almost have ended by now. But it turned out that now wasn't the end, or even the beginning of the end, as sequential budgets have pushed expectations, with yesterday's forecast from the OBR, again, pushing back the rollout of UC from what they were expecting this time last year. So this represents a major administrative challenge to UC. What did the Chancellor announce on UC yesterday? Well, yesterday's policies were aimed to address what's called the 6-week wait, which is the amount of time between when you go to claim UC and when the money actually appears in your bank account. Now, the 6-week wait is made up of 3 components. First, when you go to the job centre to claim UC, you wait for 7 days before the government starts to assess your claim. You then enter the assessment phase, where the government monitors the income that you're getting in, and so can work out what your entitlement to UC will be. After it's worked out your entitlement, it takes a few days to process and pay out the benefit. And so that adds up to the 6-week wait. Now, yesterday, the first of the government's reforms on UC was to abolish the 7-day waiting period. But the assessment period and processing time mean it will still take about 5 weeks for claimants to get their entitlement. So that was the first UC policy, abolishing the 7-day waiting period. Second relates to advances. So when you claim UC for the first time, you can request an advance on your first payment, precisely because it takes a little while to get that first payment. The Chancellor announced yesterday that from now on you'll be able to claim your full expected entitlement as opposed to half of it, which is the previous cap. It will also you can also repay it over a 12-month period as opposed to a 6-month period, which was the old limit. This will kind of smooth things to some extent for those who go to claim UC and don't have other mechanisms of drawing on income to pay the bills whilst they're waiting for that first benefit to arise. But it overall won't increase the generosity of UC in the sense that over the course of the year, you will still get paid the same amount. It's just the timing that's changed. A third change that the Chancellor announced was that if you're getting moved from the old system into UC and you get a housing benefit, you'll now also be able to get continue getting housing benefit for the first 2 weeks of your UC claim. And so people who are affected by that will be able to get some money to help with, say, upcoming rent payments. Now, taking these things together, these don't represent, in budgetary terms, a massive set of policies. But for the individuals affected, it might considerably ease the transition into UC. And the bigger picture here, in any case, is that these changes are only part of the overall transition to UC, and UC is only part of a larger package of benefit cuts that the government's announced since 2015. In the long run, UC will reduce benefit entitlements by about $5 billion a year. Not surprisingly, perhaps for a major shake-up of the benefit system, there are lots of winners from the change, but there's also lots of losers. The government's also only halfway through its 4-year freeze on most working-age benefits. Now, low inflation over the past couple of years has meant that so far this policy hasn't had too much of an effect on the real value of benefits. But as inflation rises, this policy will start to bite more in the next couple of years. And lastly, the government's announced significant cuts to child tax credit, particularly for larger families, which is a takeaway of around $5 billion a year. I'm now going to show you the distributional effects of the personal tax and benefit changes made since 2015 and how yesterday's announcement fit into that picture. So first, the measures in the budget represent a small giveaway across the income distribution. But when I put on all the changes announced since 2015, they rather dwarf what happens in the budget yesterday, as they represent a substantial loss in income for poorer households. It's worth just flagging that if we looked at the impact of policy changes since January 2010, we would see bigger losses at the bottom still as the coalition government made some benefit cuts. We would also see bigger losses at the top as back in January 2010, the top income tax rate was only 40%, now it's 45%, and also over the period, high earners have had their personal allowance removed too. Lastly, the government announced a litany of small changes to business taxes yesterday. I'm just going to give you some of the headlines from some of the bigger changes. So first, the government plans to increase the credit that can be claimed against research and development spending from 11% to 12%. There's a clear rationale for a credit of this kind. Innovation resulting from R&D spills over to the economy as a whole, and these sorts of credits do increase the amount of R&D that happen. This is a relatively small change, and so we shouldn't expect some massive increase in innovation as a result. Next, the government plans to make a couple of changes to business rates. So firstly, it's going to bring forward its switch from uprating business rates with RPI inflation to CPI inflation, bringing that forward by a couple of years. RPI inflation is typically a bit higher, and so this represents a cut in business rates of about 2%. The government's also going to switch to more frequent revaluations. This is likely to be a good thing, as it means that the rates paid will more accurately reflect local market conditions. So those are the two major giveaways to businesses. So moving on to the takeaways, the government in the budget announced a number of anti-avoidance measures, which it hopes will raise £1.5 billion a year. It's worth keeping in mind with revenue estimates from anti-avoidance measures that they're highly uncertain, so you should take that £1.5 billion number with a sizable pinch of salt. Could be higher, but could be lower. Overall, these measures seem to be aimed at closing specific loopholes and making it more difficult for companies to shift profits abroad. Second, the government's going to also be freezing the indexation allowance for capital gains for companies. This raises some revenue, but not in a particularly smart way, as it means that if a company owns an asset which rises in value purely because of inflation, when it disposes of that asset, it nonetheless has to pay capital gains on the increase, even though in real terms the asset was worth just as much as it was when they bought it. And lastly, the government plans to freeze the threshold at which companies start paying VAT at £85,000. And so in real terms, this reflects a small cut. Bring this all together, as I said, we didn't see any huge giveaways or takeaways in taxes and benefits yesterday. We saw some changes in duties, another fuel duty freeze, increasing the overall cost in a policy that's becoming quite costly now. A small policy relating to cider duties, but which in the bigger picture of things is really just a detail. They've also announced some reforms to universal credit, which may ease the early days for claimants, although, again, in the bigger picture, the government still has substantial cuts to working age benefits it's going ahead with. And lastly, on business taxes, the government announced a series of small changes, which overall are revenue raisers. So on that, I will hand back to Paul.